The air was thick with tension that day. I could feel the heat of all eyes on me as I stood in the middle of the crowded restaurant, trying to hold back tears. My husband had just humiliated me in front of everyone, his words sharp and cutting, meant to slice through any shred of dignity I had left. I had always thought I was strong, but that moment shattered me. How had I let it come to this? How could I allow the person who had promised to cherish and protect me to tear me down so publicly? I had never been one to back down from a challenge, but this felt different. I tried to force a smile, pretending like it didn't bother me, but inside, I was suffocating. Every word he spoke seemed to mock me, every glance from the other diners seemed to judge me. I felt like the walls were closing in, the laughter of the people around me growing louder as his insults pierced through the noise. The shame was unbearable. My heart pounded in my chest, and for the first time in a long while, I felt truly helpless. But then something happened. Something I couldn't have predicted. The sound of the restaurant door opening sliced through the tension, followed by the unmistakable click of high heels on the floor. I looked up, my eyes blurry with tears, and there she was, my lawyer, Emma. She stood tall and confident, her presence radiating authority. I watched as she made her way toward me, her eyes locking with mine. Without a word, she stepped into the circle that had formed around me, and for the first time that day, I felt a flicker of hope. I wasn't alone anymore. As she approached, I saw my husband's smug expression falter. He didn't recognize her at first, and for a moment, I thought perhaps this was just a coincidence. But when she reached me, she placed a reassuring hand on my shoulder and gave me a nod, one that said everything I needed to hear. She wasn't just here as a lawyer, she was here as my ally, my defender. And the look in her eyes told me one thing: this wasn't going to end the way he thought it would. I had spent years putting up with his mistreatment, thinking I had no choice but to endure it. I had been wrong. This was the turning point, the moment when I realized I had the power to fight back. It wasn't just about standing up for myself anymore. It was about reclaiming my dignity, my self-worth, and my life. I had been humiliated, but that humiliation would be his undoing, not mine. And with Emma by my side, I knew that my husband's reign of control was about to come to an end. This wasn't just a moment of revenge, it was a moment of justice. And I was ready to see it through to the end. For years, I had been living a life that, to the outside world, seemed perfect. I had everything a woman could want: an expensive home, designer clothes, vacations to exotic places. My husband, Amir, was a successful businessman, always in control, always so sure of himself. He was charming when he needed to be and ruthless when it suited him. At the beginning of our relationship, his confidence had drawn me in like a moth to a flame. I thought he was everything I needed: powerful, sophisticated, and protective. But over time, I started to realize that his protection wasn't out of love, it was out of control. We had been married for 5 years, but as the years went on, I began to feel the strain. In private, Amir was a different man. He would criticize my choices, belittle my dreams, and make me feel like I was nothing without him. When we were alone, he'd accuse me of being ungrateful for the life he had provided. He would tell me how lucky I was to have someone like him in my life, that no one else would ever love me the way he did. His words were venomous, designed to chip away at my confidence. He would tell me that no one could ever care for me like he did, that no one would understand me the way he did. But in reality, those words were a way of keeping me under his thumb, of isolating me from anyone who might see through his facade. The worst part was that I started to believe him. It didn't happen overnight, but slowly, I began to question myself. When I would try to make a decision, no matter how small, he would shoot it down, making me second-guess my own instincts. I couldn't even choose what I wanted to wear without his opinion. He was always there, lurking in the background, reminding me of how small I was without him. And the public humiliation was just one aspect of it, a constant reminder that I was always under his watchful eye. As much as I had tried to make the best of our relationship, I couldn't deny the way things were going. It felt like I was suffocating in a gilded cage. But I couldn't leave. I didn't have the courage to walk away from the life we had built together. I was trapped in a cycle of dependency, relying on him for everything from financial support to social status. People saw us as the perfect couple, the one everyone envied. Our friends were always amazed by the luxury of our life. They thought we were a match made in heaven. But the truth was, I had been gaslighting myself into believing that this was love. It wasn't. It was control. And the more I realized that, the more I felt like I was losing myself. Then there was Emma, my lawyer. I had met her through a mutual acquaintance, a woman who had gone through a similar experience. At first, I didn't know what to expect. I had always seen lawyers as people who were there to deal with legal matters, not someone I'd confide in about my personal life. But Emma was different. She had an energy about her that was hard to ignore, a quiet strength that made you feel like you could tell her anything. From our very first conversation, she didn't judge me. She listened, really listened. I could see the concern in her eyes as I spoke, but there was no pity, no condescension. It was like she was seeing through the layers of defense I had built up, and she wasn't afraid to peel them away. For the first time in years, I felt like someone understood what I was going through. She didn't promise me anything, but she gave me a sense of control. I didn't feel so helpless anymore. But it wasn't just the emotional support that Emma offered. She had a sharp mind, and she knew how to navigate the complexities of the law. In many ways, she was the opposite of Amir. While he thrived on intimidation, Emma thrived on logic and strategy. She didn't react to my husband's power plays. She countered them with facts, with precision. I started to learn from her, not just about the law, but about how to regain control of my life. She helped me see that I wasn't the helpless woman Amir made me out to be. I had options. I had power. And most importantly, I had a voice. Over time, our relationship grew beyond just legal counsel. Emma became my confidant, the person I could lean on when everything felt like it was falling apart. I began to trust her in ways I hadn't trusted anyone in a long time. We would meet regularly, and during those meetings, I would start to find the courage to speak out. I would recount all the moments Amir had undermined me, all the instances where he had humiliated me in front of friends or strangers. Emma would listen, never interrupting, but always offering me practical solutions, ways to regain control. As I spent more time with her, I started to realize how much I had been relying on Amir's approval for everything. I had been living in his shadow, constantly seeking his validation, and in doing so, I had forgotten who I was. Emma showed me that there was life outside of Amir's dominance. She reminded me that I was more than just his wife. I was Nidar, a person with dreams, passions, and a future of my own. Slowly, she helped me untangle the web of control Amir had spun around me. And yet, despite the breakthroughs I was having with Emma, I wasn't ready to leave Amir. I wasn't sure if I could. Every time I thought about it, the fear crept in. What if I failed? What if I lost everything? What would people think? These questions haunted me, and I pushed them to the back of my mind, pretending that I could just keep going on as if nothing had changed. But deep down, I knew that something had shifted. It wasn't until that fateful day at the restaurant, when Amir thought he could humiliate me in front of everyone, that I finally understood the truth. The truth that had been sitting in the back of my mind for so long. I didn't need him. I wasn't dependent on him. And no matter how hard he tried to break me down, I had the strength to rise up. Emma's presence, her quiet confidence, had awakened something in me that I thought I had lost forever. And when she walked into that room, with all the authority of a woman who knew her worth, I realized that I was not the person I had been a year ago. I was someone new, someone ready to fight back. The road ahead was uncertain, but for the first time in years, I wasn't afraid of it. It all started so innocently, at least, that's how I had tried to convince myself. When Amir first began to distance himself, it was subtle. He was busy with work, he said. His business was booming, and he was traveling more often. At first, I understood. After all, who wouldn't want a successful, driven husband? But as the days turned into weeks and the weeks into months, I began to notice the changes in him, subtle, but telling. His smiles became fewer, his patience wore thin, and the laughter we once shared slowly vanished. I became a shadow in our own home. It wasn't just the emotional distance that bothered me, it was the coldness. His love, once overflowing, became conditional. His affections were now tied to my compliance. He would praise me for my appearance, for my ability to entertain guests, for how well I kept up with his business affairs. But every compliment came with a hidden edge, a reminder that I was only valuable to him as long as I met his expectations. As long as I played the role he wanted me to play. I had always known Amir to be a man who thrived on control, but it wasn't until I saw the cracks in his mask that I realized just how deep it ran. The public humiliation I had endured that day at the restaurant was the culmination of years of emotional manipulation, but it wasn't the end of it, it was only the beginning of my fight for freedom. That evening, as Emma and I sat down to discuss what had happened, the weight of everything that had built up over the years hit me all at once. I had been living a life of constant emotional suppression, afraid to speak up, afraid to confront Amir. I had made excuses for his behavior, telling myself that he was under pressure, that it was just a phase, that maybe things would get better. But now I saw the truth, it wasn't a phase. It wasn't going to get better. This was who he was, and it wasn't something I could change. Emma was the anchor I needed. She didn't mince words. Nida, this isn't just about what happened today. This is about everything you've endured. You don't deserve to live in fear. You don't deserve to feel like you're nothing without him. You're stronger than this. Her words cut through the fog of self-doubt that had clouded my mind for so long. For the first time, I could see clearly. I didn't just feel humiliated, I felt invisible. Like my very existence was dictated by Amir's whims. My voice didn't matter unless it agreed with his. My desires didn't count unless they aligned with his plan. I had been living in a shadow for years, and I didn't even realize how much I had lost myself in it until Emma made me see it. We began to formulate a plan. The first step was to document everything, every instance of verbal abuse, every belittling comment, every act of control. I had to collect evidence, not just for the divorce, but to prove that I wasn't making things up, that Amir's actions weren't just misunderstandings. Emma knew the importance of building a case, and for the first time in a long while, I felt like I was in control. I wasn't just a passive victim anymore. I was taking back the narrative. But Amir wasn't going to let go that easily. The first time I confronted him about the incident at the restaurant, his response was exactly what I had expected: denial and anger. He claimed that he was just trying to teach me a lesson, that I was being too sensitive, that I was overreacting. He turned the blame on me, making me feel guilty for even questioning his behavior. His gaslighting was on full display, trying to convince me that my emotions were irrational, that I was the one causing the rift in our marriage. But it didn't work. Not this time. The tension between us grew with every passing day. At night, I would lie awake in bed, staring at the ceiling, wondering how I had allowed myself to get this far. How had I allowed him to take so much from me without ever questioning it? There were nights when I could feel the weight of his silence press against me, the coldness of his absence when he was in the same room. His contempt for me had become more palpable, more dangerous. His insults, once subtle, became sharper, more direct. He no longer cared to hide his disdain for me in front of our friends or family. I could see the cracks in the perfect life I had built with him. The facade we had presented to the world was starting to crumble, and I could hear the whispers. Our friends, once so enamored with the image we projected, were beginning to notice the tension. People began to ask questions, innocent ones at first, but questions nonetheless. They'd ask why we hadn't traveled in so long, why we didn't host dinner parties like we used to, why Amir was always so distant. But the answers were not so simple. As Amir became more paranoid and possessive, I found myself retreating into myself. The idea of leaving him seemed impossible. He had made sure I was financially dependent on him. All the assets we shared, our house, our cars, everything, was in his name. He controlled everything, and he made sure I felt the weight of that control. But Emma had a way of showing me the cracks in his armor. She reminded me that we didn't have to go down the traditional path. There were ways to make him pay for his actions, ways to regain what was mine without him even realizing it. One evening, as I sat at the kitchen table, going over the evidence with Emma, I made a decision. It was time. Time to stop pretending that things were okay. Time to stop allowing Amir to dictate the terms of my life. It was time to take control of my own narrative. That night, I packed a bag, just a small one, filled with the essentials, and left a note for Amir. I didn't tell him where I was going or what I was doing. I couldn't risk him manipulating me back into his grasp. The only person I could trust right now was myself, and I had to take that first step on my own. As I drove away from the house, I felt a mixture of fear and exhilaration. I was terrified of what Amir might do, of how he would react. But I was also free for the first time in years. And in that freedom, I felt a small, quiet spark of hope. A hope that, no matter what happened next, I was no longer a prisoner of his control. The battle had only just begun, and I knew it wouldn't be easy. But with Emma by my side, and the truth on my side, I was ready to fight for my freedom. And this time, I wasn't backing down. The day everything changed arrived faster than I could have anticipated. I had known it was coming, there was no avoiding it. The silence between Amir and me had stretched on for weeks, each day marked by his cold stares and mocking comments. But today, as I walked into the living room of our home, I could feel the tension in the air. Something had shifted. I could see it in the way Amir stood at the window, his back turned to me, hands clenched at his sides. The weight of his presence seemed to fill the room, like a storm waiting to break. I knew what was coming. This was it, the final confrontation. He turned slowly, his eyes narrowing as they met mine. "Where have you been, Nida?" His voice was low, almost a growl, and I could see the anger simmering just beneath the surface. He was trying to hold it together, trying to maintain control, but I could tell he was losing it. I stood my ground. For the first time in years, I didn't feel the familiar urge to shrink back, to apologize, to beg him to understand. I had spent so long justifying his behavior, but now, standing in front of him, I knew that I didn't have to. Not anymore. "I've been where I needed to be," I said, my voice steady, even though my heart was racing. "I've been getting the help I needed." His face twisted in disbelief, and for a moment, I saw the mask slip. The confident, smug Amir I had been married to for years faltered, and in its place, the real man stood exposed, a man who thrived on control, on dominance. The facade was gone, and in its place was the man who had spent our entire marriage belittling me, isolating me, controlling me. "You think you can just leave me?" he spat, his tone rising. "You think you can just walk away from all of this? From me?" His voice was shaking with rage now, and I could see his fists clenching and unclenching at his sides. "I'm not walking away from anything," I replied, taking a step closer to him, my feet steady. "I'm taking back what's mine. I'm not your property. You can't control me anymore." His eyes widened in surprise, as if he hadn't expected me to stand up for myself. He had always been able to intimidate me with his anger, to silence me with his manipulation, but not this time. This time, I wasn't afraid of his rage. I wasn't afraid of him. His face turned red, his jaw tightening as the realization hit him. "You think I'll let you destroy everything we've built? You think you can leave and take it all with you?" His voice was a low hiss now, venom dripping from each word. "You're nothing without me, Nida. You're worthless. You have nothing. No one will want you once I'm done with you." The words stung, just as they always did, but they no longer had the same power. They no longer held me captive. I had spent years internalizing his words, believing his lies, but now I could see them for what they were, empty threats, desperate attempts to maintain the control he had held over me for so long. And for the first time, I saw how small he really was, how fragile his ego was. His power came from making me feel weak, making me feel small. But no more. "You don't get to define me anymore," I said, my voice filled with conviction. "I'm not the woman you've tried to make me into. I'm not your puppet, Amir. I never was. And now I'm done playing this game." He stepped forward, his fists clenched, his eyes wild with rage. "You don't know who you're dealing with," he growled. "I'll make sure you regret this. I'll take everything from you. Everything." But before he could take another step, the doorbell rang. I didn't expect it, but I felt a strange sense of relief wash over me. I knew exactly who it was. I turned toward the door and opened it, and there, standing in the doorway with a calm, unwavering expression, was Emma. She had arrived at the exact moment I needed her the most. The moment I was about to lose my resolve, she walked in, her presence filling the room like a beacon of light. Amir froze. His face contorted in confusion and anger as he recognized her. "What the hell is she doing here?" he barked, his voice trembling with fury. Emma didn't flinch. She simply stepped inside, her eyes meeting Amir's with the same cold authority that had drawn me to her in the first place. "I'm here because Nidar has asked me to be," she said, her voice clear and firm, like a legal decree. "And I'm here to make sure that you don't get away with what you've been doing." Amir's jaw tightened as he took a step back, his anger turning to confusion. He was trying to process what was happening, trying to figure out what had just shifted in the balance of power. But the truth was simple: he had underestimated me. He had underestimated Emma. And now, the walls were closing in on him. "Listen, Amir," Emma continued, her tone unwavering. "This isn't just about what happened at the restaurant. This is about everything you've done to her over the years. And I'm here to make sure that you can't do it anymore. Nida is not alone. She never was." I could see the panic start to set in on Amir's face. His confidence was faltering, his bravado slipping away. For the first time, I saw him for what he really was, a man who had built his life on manipulation, control, and fear. But that life was crumbling in front of him, and there was nothing he could do to stop it. He opened his mouth to argue, but Emma held up a hand, silencing him. "We've already begun the legal process. You won't get away with this, Amir. Not this time." The weight of her words settled into the room, and for the first time, I saw Amir's facade crack completely. He was no longer the powerful, controlling man who had once dictated every aspect of my life. Now, he was just a man with no ground to stand on, no power left to wield. As the reality of the situation hit him, he took a step back, his eyes darting around the room like a cornered animal. But it was too late. The control he had once held over me was gone. And with it, his power over everything in my life. He had lost. In that moment, I felt a rush of emotion overwhelm me. Relief. Liberation. A sense of peace I hadn't known in years. The fight wasn't over yet, but I had won the first battle. And with Emma by my side, I knew there was no going back. I wasn't just surviving anymore. I was reclaiming my life. Amir stood there for a moment, his face twisted in rage and confusion, before he turned and stormed out of the room, leaving me standing with Emma, finally free. The silence that followed Amir's departure was suffocating, yet for the first time, it was the most peaceful silence I had ever known. As I stood in the middle of the living room, Emma by my side, the reality of the moment began to settle in. I had done it. I had stood up for myself. The chains that had bound me for so long had finally been broken. But that didn't mean the battle was over. It was just beginning. Emma turned to me, her expression softening with a hint of a smile. "You did great," she said, her voice filled with pride. "That's the first step." I felt a lump form in my throat as I tried to process everything. The events of the past few days had felt like a blur. There were moments when I had doubted myself, when I had wondered if I was making the right choice. But standing here now, in this quiet aftermath, I knew that I was finally on the path to freedom. It wasn't going to be easy, but I was no longer the woman I had been when I walked into this house. "We've already begun filing the legal papers," Emma continued, pulling me out of my thoughts. "We'll move quickly, but it's important to stay strong. Amir will fight this, of course. He'll try to manipulate the situation, to play the victim. But we have the truth on our side. We have the evidence." Her words reminded me of how much was still left to be done. I wasn't naive enough to think that the road ahead would be smooth. Amir would fight to maintain control, to hold on to the life we had built together. But as I looked at Emma, I realized that I wasn't alone in this anymore. I wasn't just fighting for myself, I was fighting for my future. For the woman I wanted to become. As the days passed, the reality of the divorce process set in. There were meetings with lawyers, paperwork to sign, and legal battles to fight. But what surprised me most wasn't the stress of it all, it was the overwhelming support I received from people I hadn't expected. Our friends, those same people who had once marveled at our picture-perfect life, began to reach out. At first, I wasn't sure what to expect. I had been isolated for so long, convinced that no one would understand or support me. But as the truth began to come to light, something changed. People I hadn't heard from in years contacted me, offering support, compassion, and encouragement. Some of them had seen the cracks in our marriage but didn't know how to help. Others were simply shocked, unable to believe that the man I had been married to could be the same one they had once admired. But perhaps the most surprising was my family. When I first confided in them about the emotional abuse I had endured, they were devastated. They had seen Amir as the perfect son-in-law, the man who had provided for me, the man who had seemingly given me everything I had ever wanted. But when they saw the truth, when they understood the extent of what I had been hiding, they rallied around me. They offered their support without question, making me feel less alone in this fight. The most difficult part, of course, was confronting Amir. The man I had once loved, the man I had trusted, had become a stranger to me. And yet, I still couldn't fully escape the grip of the past. I had spent years trying to make our marriage work, trying to salvage what had been broken. Even now, despite everything, a part of me wanted to believe that there was a chance for reconciliation, that things could somehow go back to the way they were. But as the divorce proceedings unfolded, that hope faded with each passing day. Amir, for his part, fought back viciously. He used every tool at his disposal to try and regain control, threatening legal action, attempting to manipulate the situation to his advantage, and even resorting to subtle emotional blackmail. But nothing worked. Emma had prepared me for his tactics, and I knew that I couldn't let myself be swayed by his attempts to undermine me. This time, I wasn't the same woman who had walked into this marriage 5 years ago. I had learned to stand my ground, to refuse to let his words and his actions define me. The legal battle was long, drawn out, and exhausting, but every step we took brought me closer to the future I was working toward. Emma was by my side the entire way, offering support, guidance, and encouragement. And with each victory, no matter how small, I felt myself becoming stronger. I began to see the world with new eyes. I wasn't just surviving anymore, I was thriving. Eventually, the day arrived when the divorce was finalized. It was a bittersweet moment. I felt a sense of relief, of finality, but also a deep sense of sadness. It wasn't the ending I had imagined for my life, but it was the ending I needed. The woman I had once been, the woman who had been willing to stay silent for the sake of peace, was gone. In her place stood a woman who had found her voice, who had reclaimed her power, and who was no longer afraid to fight for what she deserved. In the months that followed, I began to rebuild my life. I took time to rediscover who I was outside of Amir's shadow. I enrolled in courses, explored new hobbies, and spent time with the friends and family who had stood by me. I started to make decisions for myself, decisions that didn't need to be approved by anyone else. For the first time in years, I felt like I was living for me. But perhaps the most important thing I did was reconnect with myself. For so long, I had defined myself through Amir's eyes, what he thought of me, what he wanted from me. But now, I was free to define myself on my own terms. I didn't need validation from anyone else. I knew who I was, and I was proud of her. Looking back, I realized that the journey wasn't just about escaping an abusive marriage, it was about rediscovering who I was and reclaiming the life I had lost. It wasn't an easy journey, but it was the one I needed to take. And while I didn't know what the future held, I knew that I was ready for whatever came next. Because I had learned the most important lesson of all, that I was enough, just as I was. The story of my past would no longer define me. I had written my own ending, and it was only the beginning of a new chapter. As I stand here now, looking back on everything that has happened, I can't help but feel a profound sense of gratitude. Not for the pain, not for the broken pieces, but for the journey itself. I've spent so much of my life living in someone else's shadow, pretending that I was fine when I was anything but. I let fear control me, let shame dictate my actions, and I let myself believe that I didn't deserve more. But I now know that I am worthy of love, respect, and happiness on my own terms. The woman I am today is someone who has fought for her voice, who has taken back her power and her dignity. The strength I have discovered in myself was always there. It just needed the right circumstances to awaken. I've learned that sometimes, you have to go through the hardest moments of your life to truly understand your worth. You have to face your fears head-on and trust that, no matter how difficult it seems, you will emerge stronger on the other side. The road ahead is still uncertain, and there will be challenges. Healing isn't a straight path, It's a winding, messy journey full of highs and lows. But I am no longer afraid. I have embraced the woman I've become, and I know that I can face anything that comes my way. No one can take away the power I've reclaimed. What happened between Amir and me will always be part of my story, but it will no longer define me. It was a chapter, not the whole book. And now, I'm writing my own future. It's a future that I will build with the knowledge that I am enough, just as I am. Looking back at the woman I used to be, I realize how far I've come. And while I don't know exactly what the future holds, I do know this: I will never allow anyone to diminish my worth again. I will never shrink to fit someone else's expectations. My voice is mine. My choices are mine. And for the first time in my life, I'm ready to live for me. The door to my past has closed, but the door to my future is wide open, and I'm walking through it with my head held high. This is my new beginning, and I am no longer afraid to embrace it.